I need to make a standard disclaimer before I start, which is that any of the opinions that I offer today are mine alone and not those of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. The report that Len referenced was released recently. I brought a dozen copies with me and have left them out at the registration desk if anybody would like copies at the conclusion of the talk. I'll also give you contact information at the end if you'd like to download copies or learn a little bit more about ERS. This is a picture of the report, Transformation of U.S. Livestock Agriculture, Scale, Efficiency, and Risks. The report focuses on dairy, fed cattle, hogs, and broilers. Primary emphasis of it is on the economics of the last 2 decades of change. By that I mean changes in structure, finances of the industry, and how those finances have driven change, and outcomes in terms of prices, productivity, environmental outcomes, and some technological risks. The report itself showcases our ARMS database. I want to take a little bit of time to speak about that. It refers to the Agricultural Resource Management Survey. This is an annual survey of U.S. farms. We contact a little over 30,000 farms each year. We get 23,000 full responses. It's USDA's primary source of information on the financial performance of the U.S. agricultural sector. However, the real value of this particular survey is that it links that financial information to information on production practices, and the household of the farm operator. It enables us to do an awful lot of research with it. It's a comprehensive survey in the sense that it covers the full range of U.S. farms. It's a representative sample in the sense that we can use it to make national projections for different types of estimates. We have a variety of different versions each year. We have one version each year focused on a specific livestock commodity in which we ask a lot more questions about what's going on within that enterprise. For example, we've had hog versions in 1992, 98, 2004, and we're preparing another questionnaire to go into the field next year. With that, we're able to track changes in all elements, really, of hog production in the U.S. We have a similar span with dairy, and we're developing that span. We've had some early surveys for broilers. As that suggests, the focus of the report and the focus of my talk is on the production side. You're going to get a number of other talks this morning on developments on the demand side for livestock agriculture. This is going to be focused pretty much exclusively on what's going on the production side. First, a little bit of a preview. What do I mean by transformation? First, increased farm size. And those are fairly dramatic increases, as you'll see. Second, altered production technologies. Production technologies in feeding, breeding, housing equipment, climate controls, biosecurity, pharmaceutical technologies. Third, greater specialization of the livestock enterprise. The easy way to think about it is in hogs. We've gone from primary lines 2 decades ago on farrow to finish operations. For today, most operations are far more specialized in a particular stage of hog production. Fourth, tighter vertical coordination, whereas 2 decades ago we relied far more on spot markets for the exchange of animals. We're far more likely to rely on tighter, typically contracting options between the producer and the buyer of those animals. A little bit of a preview for the effects of the transformation. Again, we're going to go into this in considerable detail as we go along. The effects are increased productivity, meaning essentially less land, labor, capital, and feed per pound of product, whatever that product is, pounds of meat, pounds of milk, other livestock operations. That implies, as the competitive process works itself out, lower costs and lower prices ultimately for consumers. Primary beneficiaries of that productivity growth, in other words, are downstream. They're not producers. It also implies, though, real resource savings, that is, less capital, labor, land, and feed going into production. Those savings are allowed to be used somewhere else. Among the other effects are fewer competitors. That's attracted a lot of attention over the years. I think it's less important than the next two effects, which are intensified air and water pollution concerns, because consolidation of production also consolidates a great deal of manure in very localized space, and a new set of technological risks that we're going to touch on as we go along. All right, let me get into some of the details. This is a chart that shows one element of it, far fewer producers. This is based on information from the Census of Agriculture, which, as you know, covers every 5 years. I've taken this back to 1987, so we're looking at changes in the number of operations that have beef cows, broilers, milk cows, hogs, or fed cattle relative to where they were in 1987. If you notice first, that top line for beef cows, that's changed very little. There hasn't been a great deal of change in that sector. The number of farms that have beef cows, according to the Census of Agriculture, is about 9% less in 2007 than it was in 1987. That dashed line that curves around under it for broilers, that's varied up and down. By 2007, the number of farms that had broilers was about 14% less than the number that had them 20 years before. That's fairly striking in the sense that total number of broilers produced has roughly doubled in that period. The really dramatic changes, though, that you see in the last 2 decades are hogs, dairy, and fed cattle as well, which was a little surprising to me. 65% fewer farms have milk cows than had them in 1987. 75% less have fed cattle. So I have dramatic declines in the number of farms that have milk cows, hogs, or fed cattle. Farms got dramatically bigger. The number we use here is the typical, it's a median size of farm, from the point of view of the livestock. So we have a number there, if you look at the chart, that says for broilers removed in 1987 of 300,000. What that number actually is half the broilers produced in the United States came from farms larger than that in 1987. Half came from farms smaller. So in that sense, it's the midpoint of the distribution of broiler production. If you notice, between 87 and 2007, that number doubled. The typical farm removed 600,000 broilers. What's that? Roughly about 5 houses, I would think, at modern house sizes. So even though we would typically think of that industry as really having undergone dramatic changes in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, in the last 2 decades, there's been a substantial shift to much larger operations. Similarly, at fed cattle, the typical size of feedlot in 1987 shipped just over 17,000 cattle in that year, if we look at it from the point of view of where was the typical animal coming from. That size had doubled in 20 years. You see at the bottom the really dramatic transformations in hogs and milk cows. In 1987, the typical operation had 1,200 hogs removed. By 2007, it was 30,000. Now, that also captures that dramatic change in how the industry was organized, towards being much more specialized, and towards having a lot of nursery operations that are removing much smaller animals, pigs, piglets, as opposed to the feeding side. But nevertheless, it's a dramatic change in every segment of that industry. Get a milk cows. The typical farm in 1987, from the point of view of where your milk was coming from, was one with 80 cows in the herd. By 2007, it was 550. I would suspect it's considerably larger 14 months later. What's driving this? Well, scale economies matter a lot. This is drawn from our ARMS database. The solid line sloping downward you see is our estimate of costs per hundredweight of production. That's the vertical axis for farms, sorted across 6 different farm sizes for dairy farms. The smallest one is farms with 50 or fewer head. The largest is farms with 1,000 or more. We call, if you see this labeled, as full economic costs per hundredweight of production. In our estimates, we include estimates of the annualized cost of capital. We also include estimates of the opportunity cost of the operator's time, what that farm operator could have earned if they worked off the farm. So we're costing not only explicit operating costs, but the often more important implicit costs of using capital and unpaid operators' labor. There's very sharp declines in costs on average as you go from smaller to larger farms. That largest farm in 2005, that largest class, 1,000 or more, had costs that were 15% below the next largest class, 500 to 999. That's a major cost advantage and a driving force in the shifts we've been seeing, and I think that we're likely to continue to see. The red dashed line captures our estimates for those farms of gross returns per hundredweight. That's primarily driven by milk revenues, although it also includes revenues from cold cows. You'll notice for the largest farms that exceeds their full economic costs of production. They're earning what in economics we would call economic profits. Those are places that are going to attract a lot of investment if you're earning positive economic profits. You can see on average, and I'll talk a little bit more about the dispersion around averages in a minute, on average the smaller places are losing a lot of money compared to full economic cost of production. Now 2005 was a decent year. You might ask about, well, what's going on this year? Well, that red line's dropped down quite a bit. Hardly anybody's earning economic profits this year in dairy. That blue line's up a bit because feed costs are higher. But the slopes haven't changed as near as we can estimate with the data available. That is, those scale economies are still pretty powerful. Similar, though not quite as striking relationship, holds in hog production. We're able to do the same sort of estimates based on the data we derived from our hog versions. This was 2004. We show estimates of costs of production compared to different size categories of hog operations. In here we measure size by annual pounds gained. So if you think of, and these are for finishing animals. So if you think of a feeder to finish operation is taking a 50-pound piglet and growing it to 250 pounds, you could take that the numbers on the horizontal axis and divide them by 200, then multiply by 1,000 because they're in thousands to get to a size of farm in terms of hogs removed. The largest one would be a farm removing 12,500 hogs in a year, a feeding operation. If you notice, the two largest size classes in that chart have costs that are pretty similar, but they are much lower than the smaller size operations. Those cost differences are driving strong shifts towards much larger operations over time. One more point, these costs matter dramatically for financial performance. In this chart, I've gone back to our dairy data. We could do it for a variety of different commodities, but this was easy to pull together for you. Again, we sort here at the bottom axis across farm size classes, from 50 to less over to 1,000 or more. What the lower dotted red line shows you is the proportion of farms in each size category for whom gross economic returns are covering all of their economic costs. They're making profits over and above the cost of capital. They're likely to achieve, to get increased investment in the future. Two things I think jump out when you look at that. First, again, that strong size relationship again. Far more of the large farms are making profits than among the smaller farms. But nevertheless, there's variability. Some of the large farms are earning losses. Some of the smallest farms are profitable. Some people are unlucky. Some people are lucky. Some people aren't very good at what they're doing. Some people are really good at what they're doing. That gives you a great deal of variation within any size class. But the means also across size classes represent very large differences and very strong pressures to get bigger. The larger line, the top line, the blue line, calculates profits in a different way. It asks for the proportion of farms for whom revenues exceed all of their costs except capital costs. The reason why that's important is that once you got an operating farm, the question is whether I should keep it operating or shut it down. I may not be interested in replacing the capital, but it's an economically viable operation as long as you can cover operating costs and the operator can earn as much as that operator can earn somewhere else. Operating costs will increase over time as capital starts to wear down, and you'll eventually shut the place down when the operating costs exceed revenues. But if I use that standard, particularly in the middle, a significant number of farms are viable in 2005. fewer of them today. That means a considerable number of mid-sized farms would stay in operation, and it makes sense to keep them in operation for a long time. This is why these structural changes play out over periods of 10, 20, and 30 years. You don't get dramatic changes in a year or two, because once you've built these operations, it makes sense to keep operating. Is cost the only driver of size changes? So far, I've emphasized the advantages of larger size, and that scale economies are driving those shifts to larger operations. No, it's not the only driver, but it matters a great deal. There is a lot of variation within size classes in cost, so it can't be the only driver. But boy, those big average differences really drive some shifts over time. What else matters? I think contracting and coordination has played a separate role aside from just cost advantages in driving shifts towards larger operations. I think demand growth has played a role, in particular slowing demand growth in some businesses. In the report, we go into the question of whether policy, in particular commodity policy, has had an impact on changes in farm size. I don't think it has. I don't think it's had a major impact. I actually don't think it's had even a minor impact. But I'll leave that for the report, because that's a fairly technical, detailed type of issue. What's the impact of increased scale? Reduced costs, which implies less feed, labor, land, and capital used. Those frees those resources for other uses. Those costs imply reduced prices for consumers as competition drives prices to costs. But I should emphasize, that's a long-standing story in agriculture, and its impact is shrinking. The reason why its impact is shrinking is that the share of farm costs in retail price continues to decline over time. Share of farm costs in the retail, on average in retail prices of foods, is somewhere around 20% now. 20 years ago, it was probably 25 to 28%. So what happens with the farm sector in terms of prices is having a shrinking impact at the retail end. Nevertheless, it's had, as we'll see, a cumulative strong impact over time. I'll give you a few charts that show something of that. Here what I'm tracking are various price series, and I'll detail them for you in a little bit. Since 1980, the solid line shows the trend in economy-wide prices over time, measure of economy-wide inflation. That's increased about 3% a year if you track it over 27 years, from 1980 to 2007. The dashed line shows the trend over time in the prices of agricultural inputs. You can see that fluctuates a lot more than economy-wide prices. And in the last few years, of course, it rose sharply going into 2007 with increases in oil prices driving increases in fertilizers and chemicals used in agriculture. But you can see it follows the same general trend as economy-wide prices. That lower line are the prices paid to farmers for agricultural products. You can see an increase right at the end, getting into 2007, good year for crops, good year for livestock. But in general, that rose far less over time than prices in the overall economy. Price in the overall economy grew about 3% per year. If I took the average increase over for that full 2007 period, prices for farm products grew about 1.1% per year. The difference between the two is productivity growth, that you're using a lot less inputs to produce a given amount of output. In fact, we put a lot of effort into developing a productivity series using a different approach, that is, actually trying to get at measures of quantities. We checked that by looking at the differences in prices over time, the differences between the growth in the price of inputs and the price of outputs, and it gives us the same numbers. The difference between those price series is the sharply higher productivity growth in agriculture than in the rest of the economy. Now, how does that play out as it moves through the system? This chart shows trends in processed food prices, that is, prices as they leave the factory. This is from what's called the Producer Price Index. So prices of processed foods as they leave processing plants and go to retailers. You see they rise far less than the economy-wide prices. They rose about 2% per year, while economy-wide prices rose at 3% per year. The gap is less than the gap between agricultural products and the overall prices because there isn't dramatic productivity growth in processing. So that impact of productivity growth in agriculture gets dampened a bit, but nevertheless, food prices have grown about 1% less per year for 27 years because of that high productivity growth at the agricultural end. Now, that's an aggregate. That's processed food prices. If I compare it to the things that are the subject of today's talk, meat prices and dairy prices, you see dairy rose up a lot in 2007. If I extended another year, it had dropped down pretty sharply. Meat and dairy products, that is, the prices of those products as they leave meat packing plants or as they leave dairy processing facilities, grew about 1.6% per year over that 27-year period, compared to 3% in economy-wide price growth. So that productivity growth in agriculture translates into much lower price growth in the products that come from agriculture to the household. Those represent substantial benefits to purchasing households. That's the good side of consolidation in agriculture in recent years. What are the problems? Problems just come down to competition, environmental risks, and technological risks. Competition issues are basically fewer but larger buyers. If you're a producer of fed cattle, there are 4 buyers in most of the plains. 1 or 2 of them might not like you, might not want to buy from you if you're a feedlot operator. So that's about the maximum that you might typically face. There was a major increase in concentration in meatpacking in the 1980s as firms built much bigger plants. If you're a broiler grower, there are typically 1 to 3 integrators that you might be able to deal with. About half of our growers tell us they have 1 integrator that they deal with in their area. If you're a hog producer, you've got a little bit more, 2 to 4 integrators, plus some cash market options. If you're a dairy producer, there's fewer local buyers, but there's cooperatives. Typically, people operate through cooperatives. There may be a variety of issues that farmers have with their cooperatives, but it's a different competitive relationship than you might have with an integrator. Let me speak a little bit about competition for fed cattle, which gets a great deal of congressional and media attention. During the 1980s, packing plants got a lot bigger. They realized significant scale economies. Those packing margins fell noticeably. They were able to realize much lower costs. Lower margins meant lower prices, increased demand for animals, and that side of the pressure benefited producers. That combined with very slow demand growth, particularly for beef, to greatly reduce the potential number of buyers. In other words, packing plants got a lot bigger. People weren't buying anymore. That forced small plants and small firms out of business. The big question since then, as we got down to 4 competitors, is 4 enough for competition in the business? There's an immense amount of academic and government research work on this topic. The evidence is, it looks like it is, up till now. We don't find strong evidence of significant market power. By that I mean, if I look across a series of studies, some of them find that the outcomes look just like competition. In other words, the prices I get paid for cattle with 4 producers look a lot like what I would get for 20 or 30. Some of them find a limited evidence of market power. That is, prices paid are a little bit lower than they would otherwise be, than they would be if I had a fully competitive market. The big question in the past year, though, was, is 3 enough for competition? Because JBS Swift, the number 3 producer, wanted to purchase the number 4 producer, National. That would have cut the number of buyers down to 3 in most areas. That's a little bit different question, because at some point, buyers are likely to realize there aren't that many of them, and likely to be able to exercise some degree of market power. This became a major issue this year as the Justice Department looked closely at it. Justice Department announced it was going to oppose that merger. Again, I have to emphasize my standard disclaimer in that these are my opinions and not those of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. I thought that was probably the correct decision. Even though I look at the industry as being pretty competitive now, I'd be worried about going down to 3. So the department opposed that merger, and the merger was eventually dropped by JBS Swift. All of those issues, and these are issues we've dealt with for 20 or 25 years in economics analyses of the business, are about a sort of classic type of market. Prices in transactions for cattle, buying and selling the product. Competition issues in hogs and broilers are different. It's not a market for the livestock. Very little sales of broilers, or these days even of hogs. It's a market for what's called grower services. In that case, the question is, not whether growers really have many alternatives among integrators, but whether they have alternatives for their time. Local employment, manufacturing options, crop production, that's what constrains what an integrator can do. At the initial stage, those are probably fairly competitive. The big questions concern whether growers can be locked in. Typically, a grower makes an investment in a house that's going to last for 10 years. The contracts are often very short term. There are possibilities for integrators to exercise some market power, to force fees down at times of renegotiation. Those have been major issues in recent years. I think they're going to get more important, frankly, looking to the future, because broiler demand growth is starting to slow. I think we're likely to see more conflicts between integrators and growers and broilers in the future, and that's going to be an ongoing issue for Congress and for policymakers. But I think those are less important than the next two issues I'm going to talk about in terms of impacts of the transformation. First, environmental risks. Large operations concentrate manure. Manure's got value, fertilizer and soil amendment, but the nutrients, pathogens, and gases in manure create substantial threats to water resources and to air resources. Large farms remove a great deal of manure. Among our very largest operations, some remove all of it to other farms. Typically, we're seeing them removing 30 and 40%. Even with removals, a lot remains, far more relative to the land base than on smaller farms. It's often in excess of the agronomic requirements of the land. Because of that, we're seeing increasing regulation, increased federal CAFO rules. I expect the final CAFO rule that the EPA passed in the fall is going to get subject to a lot of litigation. Nevertheless, even though we've seen responses of farmers to it in the last few years, it's having an impact, even though I don't know if it's really going to be the final rule. We're seeing increasing state and local regulations and permitting, and we're seeing lawsuits. I don't see these as altering structure. By that I mean, I think it'll have an impact on the geographic location of where we put these operations. I don't see an impact on size structure. The reason why we don't expect a structural impact is that we don't think it's going to cost a lot to adjust to regulation. Current removal expenses amount to 1 to 4% of production costs at large farms for those farms that are removing manure. Those are consistent with ERS projections from 5 and 10 years ago, studies of what it would cost to comply with the CAFO rules, where we projected it would amount to about 1 to 3% of production costs at large farms. That's a small fraction of the advantages that large farms have over small farms. So for that reason, we think these regulations are going to bite. We think they're going to have a big impact on what people do. I don't see them fundamentally altering how agriculture is organized. We do in our data see interesting responses over time. We see altered manure loadings, that is, changes in the amount of manure associated with a given amount of production, through breeding, through altered feed formulations, and through additives to feed. I expect we're going to see a good deal more of that as we go out with further surveys. We see people spreading over more land, either through acquisition or through renting more land. The question here is, I expect that we're going to see a lot more of that and a great deal more pressure to move manure. And we're going to see if we're going to find better and expanded markets for manure. I think there'll be a great deal more movement going on. There's a great deal of interest in new uses, particularly energy production. There's a great deal of interest in perhaps government intervention and funding for it. Right now, that's a small player. It may become larger in the future. Manure is one major outcome. Second is technological risks, particularly associated with the use of antibiotics. We know that subtherapeutic doses of antibiotics are widely used for growth promotion and disease prevention, particularly industrialized operations. We know there's a growing controversy over issues of whether the use of STAs lead to growing pathogen resistance. I think it's likely that we're going to see more limits on STA use. We've seen bans in Europe. We see retailers being fairly leery about it and placing restrictions on their use for their products. I think we're likely to see more of that. What does the report offer? Well, we don't have anything to say about the science of it. Our surveys can't tell us anything about that, and we don't have the skills to do it anyway. But we can look at the economics of it. We can talk about the extent of the use of subtherapeutic antibiotics among hog and broiler operations by size and type of operation. We can talk about the alternatives that are in use. Even at large operations, we see a substantial number who say they're not using subtherapeutic antibiotics. Well, they might be lying. It's a sensitive topic. But they also seem to be doing things a lot differently, typically, than the operations who say they are using it. And we can take a look at the costs of limiting STA use by comparing those operations that aren't using them to those that are. Here's a little bit of evidence from our reports on it. First, we look at the incidence of use across hog farms. We're looking at by size of farm here, and we're looking at the percentage of farms that use STAs. Among the largest operations, and these are for feeding out animals, these are finishing operations. Among the largest operations, about 70% say they're using subtherapeutic antibiotics. It suggests there's a substantial number that aren't. We're down around 20 to 25% of the smallest operations are using them. So it is a very strong relationship with size of operation in hogs. Doesn't really in broilers. Pretty much the same proportion in every size class seems to be using them. We're able to do some research on the effects of STAs on hog production costs. We found they were substantial on nursery operations. Places that said they weren't using them had substantially higher costs. They had a noticeable, very powerful impact on productivity and on costs in those operations. However, on the finishing side, the differences in costs between those farms that said they used them and those that didn't, while controlling for a lot of other factors, like size of operation in particular, was small and not statistically significant. We couldn't find any impact on productivity or on costs of using them in finishing operations. That implies, if one's thinking about regulation of these things, that there is a scope for focused adjustments and for sensible regulation. There are places where they appear to be quite valuable. There are places where there may be substitute processes that work just as well at relatively limited cost. One last chart. We have ongoing work from our broiler survey on the issue. This chart compares other production practices used by farms that say they provide subtherapeutic antibiotics in their feed or water compared to farms that say they don't. And what we find is that there's a clear difference in types of strategies that farms are using. Those operations that say they don't have STAs in their feed and water are far more likely to be testing for various types of pathogens in their feed and in their broilers. They're far more likely to have a series of sanitation practices that they're carrying out, and they're far more likely to have a HACCP plan in place. We intend to use this and to look more closely at the impacts of these different operating strategies on productivity, on costs in those operations. Let me conclude. There are powerful economic forces driving consolidation of livestock production. I think those forces are still in place and they're likely to continue. That consolidation creates significant benefits in the form of lower prices and resource savings. Also creates environmental risks. I think those risks are likely to bring us increased regulation over time. And the big question is our regulation going to be effective? I think there's substantial scope for effective regulation. And then the challenge is how to make it effective. If you need more information, as I said, I've left copies of some print copies of the report at the registration desk. You can also obtain copies from ERS. You can get a lot of data on U.S. farms, both from our data tool and our briefing rooms at our website. And you have my contact information at the bottom if you want to get in touch with me.